Welcome to a deep dive. Today we're heading to the northeastern coast of South America, to a really fascinating country, Guyana.
It really is.
Yeah,
Geographically South American, of course,
yeah.
but culturally it feels quite distinct, doesn't it?
Completely. And it's the only English-speaking country on the continent, which immediately sets it apart.
Right. And that geography, it's key. You've
Yeah.
got this narrow, low-lying coastal strip where almost everyone lives.
Yeah. And then behind that, just vast, dense interior, forests, mountains, largely untouched.
A huge contrast. And bordered by Suriname, Brazil, Venezuela, its position has always been, well, crucial.
Absolutely. And we've got this great collection of sources, articles, research papers you shared, which really let us unpack how Guyana got to be the way it is.
Shaped not just by the environment, but by these successive waves of people, historical forces. It's quite a story.
So that's our mission today,
Yeah.
right? To pull out the key insights, the maybe surprising connections from these sources.
Exactly. Give you a real handle on Guyana's journey from its earliest days right up to the present, including the massive changes happening now with oil.
And it's a journey that touches on some big themes. We'll be looking at the legacy of colonization, that brutal plantation system.
The struggle for independence, which was heavily influenced by the Cold War, surprisingly enough.
Yeah, and the challenges after independence, economic struggles, social issues.
And then this huge transformation recently with the oil discoveries, which brings both massive potential and, frankly, some significant risks.
Okay, let's start unpacking. Maybe begin with the land itself. The sources give some good detail.
Right. So size-wise, about 215,000 square kilometers.
Yeah.
But the crucial point, as we said, is that population concentration. Nearly 90% live along that roughly 430-kilometer coast.
And Georgetown, the capital, is right there in the most populous region, Demerara-Mahaka.
Yeah. Then you have Essequibo Islands, Bourbon's Quarantine, and then the huge, sparsely populated Upper Tucutu Upper Essequibo in the interior.
And this geography isn't just lines on a map, it dictates life. The sources mention, half the country near the coast is below sea level.
That's right. So flooding is a constant, fundamental reality they have to manage.
And the interior, mostly tropical rainforest, then savanna further inland, and those really important mangrove systems on the coast.
And this unique geography supports incredible biodiversity. The sources really emphasize this wildlife. Reptiles, fish, birds. It's exceptionally rich.
A natural bounty, but also, a challenge for development versus conservation.
Definitely. Now, going way back, one interesting point from the sources is that during those very early human migrations into northern Brazil and Venezuela, this specific area seems to have been uninhabited.
Really? Why is that?
Well, the thinking is it's relatively smaller size and maybe distance from the main routes. So you don't find the same kind of super early archaeological evidence you see elsewhere nearby.
Oh. So the first known inhabitants were the Amerindian peoples, arriving later.
Correct. Believed to have come from the Orinoco Valley, moving into the Essequibo Basin and inland. Descendants of earlier groups from the Ice Age land bridge.
And the sources mention different archaeological traditions, Orinoco, Guyana, Carib.
Yeah, indicating different groups or periods. Early European accounts give us a glimpse of their life. Horticultural villages, growing staples like cassava, maize, sweet potatoes.
Elders as oracles, timber and palm houses, and warfare seems to have been significant for men.
Right, often linked to vengeance or territory. And their beliefs, according to these accounts, centered on a creator, nature spirits they called Manitou, and the souls of living things. Shamans were key figures.
But what really struck me in the sources was the emphasis on the Amerindian perspective itself.
Oh, absolutely crucial. They fundamentally believed they were the rightful owners of the land, full stop.
And they argued against British claims based on treaties. But the sources detail how their land was taken. Unscrupulous deals, trickery, forgery.
Debt retailing, forced land surrenders for towns. It's a pretty stark list of appropriation methods described in the material.
And the outcome for many tribes was tragic, disappeared after contact. Only a few, like the Kalinagos, Arawaks, Weranos, are still well documented.
Some adapted, sure, combining farming and hunting. But the dispossessed often ended up among the poorest, classified now as cultural minorities. That history casts a long shadow.
And it's poignant that many still speak Arawakan languages referred to as a nation. There's that quote from the native literature, Sanakins.
Lamenting the difficulty of protecting the soil, the state of ancient rock inscriptions, a powerful symbol of that threatened heritage.
Okay, so building on that indigenous foundation, let's shift to the Europeans. Columbus, 1498, explores the Orinoco mouth.
Under the Spanish flag, yeah. And that's where the El Dorado myth really takes hold. He names it the province of El Dorado.
And the Spanish chased that dream, didn't they? Mid-16th century, first serious colonization attempts.
But they ran into fierce resistance from the Arauca people. Spain claimed that huge Orinoco Amazon region, but holding it was another matter. Explorers pushed inland, finding some gold, native settlements.
They even tried establishing missions like San Jose de Maturin.
Right, but it got attacked by Caribbean raiders. Spain's grip, especially on the coast, was pretty weak.
Which opened the door for the Dutch.
Exactly. By the late 17th century, the Dutch had effectively pushed the Spanish off the coast up to the Essequibo. 1621, the Dutch West India Company, the WIC, formally claims the territory.
And they set up settlements like Fort Cake overall by the 1650s.
But interestingly, the sources suggest their initial focus wasn't really large-scale farming.
More about resources, gold, silver, timber.
Precisely. Limited plantation agriculture only came later, around the 1730s. But they faced challenges too. Increased Carib attacks forced them to abandon some settlements.
Planters fled towards Demerara. It sounds like a constant struggle.
It was. Against the environment, the French, the British. The Dutch even briefly withdrew before settling in Berbice, apparently with some Portuguese help. Cotton became big in Berbice later, early 1790s.
So this back and forth eventually leads to British control.
Right, through a series of struggles. A key moment seems to be a British invasion, launched interestingly from Saramacca in Dutch Suriname next door.
And that invasion force, the makeup is telling. Disbanded soldiers, captains.
But also 1,000 armed enslaved people and planters seeking revenge. Quite a coalition.
And it was successful, leading to Suriname's capital surrendering.
That's what the sources indicate. And after a treaty, this larger territory, including what became British Guiana, permanently fell under British authority. They secured it militarily first.
Which brings us squarely to the system that would define Guyana for centuries, the plantation economy.
Absolutely foundational, and at its core, sugar, powered by brutal, forced labor.
The sources mention 1,000 enslaved people introduced early 18th century, but they needed more.
So they captured people locally, bought them from indigenous groups, and crucially, started importing vast numbers from Africa.
The scale mentioned for the mid-18th century is staggering. 800 in 1764, over 1,500 in 1773.
But with incredibly high mortality rates. The conditions were horrific. And legally, these people were treated as property, chattel slavery.
The descriptions of the plantations themselves are chilling. Free states ruled by masters.
Planters, managers, with basically no outside interference, as the sources put it. The layout itself speaks volumes. Hundreds of acres of cane, boiling houses, curing houses.
And that stark separation. Huts for laborers and Negroes, separate from overseers and bakers.
The details really paint a picture. The network of trenches for drainage, transport, grass fields for cattle, the montados, constant felling of timber, clearing bush, eventually mechanical transport for the cane.
A totally controlled, self-contained system geared for maximum profit through absolute control.
Then comes abolition, 1833 in the British West Indies. But planters were already nervous before that, weren't they? Events in Demerara in 1823.
Right, so they started looking for a new source of cheap, controllable labor.
Which led to the system of indentured labor, primarily from India, brought over through a deal with the government, often called coolies in the sources.
And they worked persistently, crucially, for lower wages than the formerly enslaved people.
The material says they were treated moderately better, but like we noted, that's relative. It was still deeply exploitative. Though interestingly, they did find small ways to adapt, marrying earlier, maybe investing in tiny land plots when possible.
But by 1911, this classical plantation economy, as the sources call it, was crashing.
Yeah, several factors. The foreignness of the indentured laborers wore thin, apparently. But more significantly, Indian farmers started asserting more control over land and their own work.
They weren't channeling the surplus back to the plantations in the same way.
Exactly. Planters tried squeezing profits, using no-tolerance policies against any organizing attempts. But then came the rise of the sugar union,
which the sources describe as a real turning point.
A pivotal moment, yes. It challenged that old structure of fear and planter pride. Crucially, the unions became multi-ethnic, focusing workers on shared economic interests over just ethnic background. It shifted power dynamics.
And many indentured laborers shifted towards rice production.
Yes, and not just for themselves. They supplied markets, it grew, became vital to the local economy, and eventually a staple across the Caribbean.
So you really see how this whole history, slavery, indenture, the plantation system laid down these complex layers of ethnicity, class, and social structure that would just dominate Guyana's future.
Which leads us right into the turbulent path to independence. Post-WWII, decolonization is this huge global force, right? But it's messy.
And British Guiana is presented as a classic example of how formal independence didn't automatically solve deep-seated problems.
Definitely not. You had immense external pressures. The Cold War looms large, the U.S. wanting stability, Britain wanting out of its empire. Their interests often clashed right here.
And internally, a national democratic movement emerges after 1941, initially crossing racial lines, which is interesting.
But the existing political structures that limited legislative council just couldn't contain these new aspirations.
Enter the main political parties, the PPP and the PNC. Started as partners, but split after 55.
Largely along left-right lines, yeah. And the sources characterize the PPP as communist-leaning. Its electoral success really complicated things, preventing a smoother democratic transition.
Dr. Chetty Jagan and the PPP are central here. The sources say party polarized society racially.
That's the description. Most Indo-Guyanese supporting it, most Afro-Guyanese rejecting it, partly due to that perceived communism and Moscow links.
Yeah.
And crucially, it was the fear of a PPP win in the 53 elections that brought direct Anglo-American intervention.
That Cold War lens is just inescapable, isn't it?
Totally. The U.S. saw British Guiana as the most serious threat of communism outside Europe. They feared another Cuba, right there on the mainland. American anti-communist policy, the sources argue, is the best explanation for what happened, including the use of naked force.
So by the early 60s, even though independence was being called for widely,
paradoxically, the sources suggest none of the big players, UK, US, even the local parties, actually wanted full independence right then. Too much fear of instability, rising tensions.
So instead of just letting go, Britain and the U.S. tried to manage the process?
Pretty much. The sources mentioned British attempts to sway the 61 election, maintaining internal self-government in 64, rather than pushing for full decolonization immediately. For the U.S., after Castro, having a friendly government in Georgetown was paramount.
And this pressure cooker environment, combined with those historical ethnic divisions, it boiled over into violence.
Tragically, yes. Divisions suppressed under colonialism just fractured violently. Hundreds died, thousands displaced. The 1964 elections were marred by it. The sources state the PNC took power partly through popular violence against the PPP and its supporters.
It's described as high velocity, high pressure, specific violence against East Indian PPP supporters, riots, burning property, even an assassination attempt on Jagan mentioned for Feb 64.
Yeah, and a significant outflow of East Indians from Georgetown and affected coastal areas during that time.
So independence in 1966. It's framed as both a crowning achievement, obviously, but also a moment of deep crisis and fear.
Exactly. Civil war was a real fear. But the election results, that fight for Georgetown especially, kind of forced the issue. Independence came, perhaps sooner than some wanted or expected.
It's just such a clear example of how those big geopolitical games can intersect with and worsen really deep internal fault lines. A very difficult birth for the nation.
And things didn't immediately get easier after 1966. The sources say initial economic promise was quickly exterminated by civil unrest.
The economic picture sounds grim. Problems across the board. Rice industry issues.
Local markets, international markets, unreliable shipping, bad pricing, spoilage, you name it. And sugar, still 90% of earnings then, faced disaster. Bad harvest, plummeting prices due to market changes, the Caribbean Sugar Protocol shifts, high wages, strikes.
A perfect storm, really, and the impact spread.
Absolutely. Estates struggled, contractors, businesses felt it, banks closed, tax collection basically stopped. Financial institutions started shifting focus towards just supporting self-sufficiency.
Efforts to reduce multinational control in rice failed due to the unrest. Ministry of Agriculture neglecting duties.
That's what the sources report. Cane industry contracted too. Bauxite faced ownership battles, failed negotiations, and oil and gas. Guyana was surprisingly late to that game, only attracting real foreign interest much, much later.
And the social impact of all this economic trouble.
Pretty devastating. Huge income gap, one of the largest in the region. That 1988 statistic is stark. 40% living on less than $1 a day. Gini index, 0.53, third highest.
And focusing on mining meant other sectors suffered?
Right. Few export goods, little foreign currency, soaring prices for imported basics because they weren't producing enough themselves. That import-export price index imbalance is mentioned.
Leading to more strikes, protests, a sense of deep injustice.
Exactly. The sources use phrases like untamed by equity and justice, and even the crazed emptiness to describe the mood around 1990. It sounds like a really difficult time for ordinary people.
But amidst this, there was a major ideological shift, or attempt at one, the cooperative republic.
Yes, the 1980 Constitution declared Guyana a cooperative republic and a cooperative socialist state. The idea was to build the economy and society around collective ownership, regulation, and voluntary cooperation.
Chetty Jagan framed it as an evolution, linking the state to existing cooperative efforts.
Right, defining cooperation as working in harmony for a common goal, acknowledging it could be viewed negatively, but emphasizing the positive potential.
And there are examples: farmers' associations, urban co-ops.
Rural collaboration, yes. And specifically, the Guyana Cooperative Agricultural and Industrial Development Bank, GCADB. Even cooperation in education spread.
The sources even note the number of cooperatives present at Independence Day celebrations: 112 co-ops, over 13,000 members. So the idea had roots.
It did. But the 1980 Constitution elevated it to the core organizing principle of the state, at least in theory.
So you see this attempt to forge a different path, born out of the failures of the post-plantation economy and the post-independence turmoil, a deliberate effort to create something new.
Which brings us more towards the contemporary era. Politics still complex, evolving since the late 20th century. PPPC and PNC remain major forces, but new parties emerged in the 90s.
And that return to democracy after the Burnham administration is highlighted, a mix of joy and disappointment.
Yeah, the sources mentioned a 1997 court ruling on election irregularities, then the 98 election, where the ruling party was heavily defeated, ending what one source calls the most autocratic regime outside Cuba.
A return of freedoms on the airwaves, for instance. An open debate, like over budget cuts in 98, calls for integrity.
Recent elections have been incredibly intense. That 2015 mother of all elections, a slim PPPC defeat, APNU plus AFC taking office.
Then that government fell after a no-confidence vote in 2018.
And the 2020 presidential contest is described as particularly fraught. Palpable fear of ethnic strife again.
But ultimately, democracy held, a celebration of the process.
Fortunately, yes. But this political tension is now playing out against an absolutely transformative backdrop, the oil boom.
This has put Guyana firmly on the global map, hasn't it?
Massively. The world's attention is now on Guyanese oil. Investors are clamoring for a piece, seeing recent elections as creating a safe business bet, particularly for the U.S. and its allies.
Leading to sudden wealth, especially for the elite.
That's the description. Though the sources do mention PPPC government proposals for things like an extractive industry transparency initiative framework, cash grants, a wealth fund, suggesting attempts, at least on paper, to manage this influx.
And the economic potential. The ECLAC recommendations suggest it's huge.
Very promising.
Right.
High return opportunities, low overheads initially. There's that striking comparison to China earlier this decade. Undeveloped agriculture industry, competing development ideas focus on industrialization.
So rapid growth seems likely.
Highly likely in the next decade. But here's the crucial caveat, the warning in the sources. A grave danger of not escaping the poverty trap, despite the oil money.
How so? The resource curse.
Essentially, yeah. Risk of exacerbating inequality, corruption, neglecting other vital sectors, becoming overly dependent. It requires incredibly careful management.
Culturally, the sources paint a picture of incredible diversity, mixed and heterogeneous.
Indian, Amerindian, African, Chinese, Portuguese influences all converging, especially visible in the arts. But this diversity also fuels that constant debate about ethnic domination, placing culture right at the center of politics and society.
Institutions like the Museum of African Heritage are mentioned, doing important work.
Yes, connecting to African and African Guyanese cultures,
Yeah.
countering historical narratives of subjugation,
Yeah.
using artifacts for education, raising consciousness.
And performing arts expanding, bringing international culture, but also debate.
Right. Excitement about foreign participation in Carnival, but also fears of losing uniqueness. Debates about including traditional African customs, galleries, museums, bookstores, signs of hope for nourishing culture.
So, contemporary Guyana, grappling with this sudden oil wealth, building on a complex past, navigating political challenges, trying to ensure equitable growth. It's a lot.
A huge amount to juggle. And remember, beyond the oil, Guyana's natural wealth is immense. Those forests, 4.1 million hectares. Minerals, gold, bauxite, diamonds, clay, lime, granite. though extraction has been limited for some.
Huge river systems, waterfalls, lakes full of fish, orchids, valuable timber like mahogany, purple heart.
And there are efforts mentioned to manage this. Monitoring by universities, joint ventures, national programs, education, training, plans for village park rangers, expert systems for wildlife.
So there's awareness of the need for stewardship.
There is. But the environmental concerns are significant, especially with extraction ramping up. Pristine forests, biodiversity. It's high on the agenda, but the threats are real.
Specific endangered species are mentioned. Ivory-billed woodpecker, though claimed extinct. There's that 1944 sighting anecdote. Spoon-billed sandpiper, red siskin.
Plus invasive species like loosestrife on the coast. And pollution is a major worry. Those rivers, once thought pristine, are disturbed.
Things like the Essequibo Regatta causing damage.
Refuse, bank destruction, yeah. But the big one highlighted is pollution from gold and diamond mining. Mercury and sediment run off into creeks.
A world expert quoted expressing concern about ecological integrity.
Exactly. And the amount of cyanide brought in by gold mining companies since '93 is flagged as alarming, especially given earlier beliefs about pesticides.
And since gold mining was already a big chunk of GDP, maybe a fifth before oil, mercury pollution is a serious ongoing issue.
Huge concern for ecosystems and potentially human health through the food chain.
It really poses that fundamental question, doesn't it? How do you balance this incredible resource wealth and economic potential with protecting a unique, fragile environment?
It's the tightrope walk. And that balance, or lack of it, impacts Guyana's international relations too. Foreign policy shaped by its location, the Guyana Shield, Brazil's strategy, often reactive, legalistic, peaceful, but dominated by neighborly disputes.
Relations with Brazil sound generally amicable since independence, shared regional memberships.
Yes. Brazil's interested in oil investments, PDVSA supplies. Guyana wants commercial ties. Brazil sees Guyana strategically, especially under Lula, as a partner for sustainable development.
And there's talk of big infrastructure projects, power connections, roads, a development bank.
Historically relevant projects, yes. And security interests align combating narcotics, balancing Venezuela. Guyana welcomes Brazil's influence as a counterweight. Though interestingly, the sources note a historically unfavorable sociocultural perception of Brazil among Guyanese.
Border disputes with Brazil were settled, though. 1906 treaty, later demarcation.
Correct. Suriname, however, has been more difficult. Maritime territory claims led to brief armed confrontation. International mediation helped partly resolve it, but it's still sensitive.
And Venezuela, amicable cooperation in many areas, but...
But the massive territorial claim Venezuela maintains has bedeviled relations since independence. No formal conflict, thankfully,
Right.
and there's a binational commission, but it's a huge underlying issue.
Regionally, Guyana seems quite active. UNICEF founding member?
Yes, active in reforms, dialogue, health council, energy and climate change work. Also ECLS-SME, and a founder member of CARICOM back in '72.
Founder member of the Association of Caribbean States, too, first president. Even involved in Central American Integration System consultations.
Right. Technical seminars, trade committees, showing engagement across different regional groupings.
So you see it navigating that unique space between South America and the Caribbean, managing these complex neighbor relations, actively participating regionally, and now all of that is being reshaped by the oil factor.
It adds a whole new layer of complexity and potential influence to its international standing.
Wow. We really have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Guyana's journey, from those indigenous foundations.
Through European colonization, the deep scars of the plantation economy, slavery, indenture.
Then that incredibly fraught path to independence, marked by internal divisions, Cold War politics.
The tough post-independence years, political turmoil, economic hardship, the attempt at a different model with the cooperative republic.
And landing in contemporary Guyana, diverse, resource-rich, facing the immense potential and perils of oil wealth, navigating its politics, engaging regionally.
It's been fascinating pulling these threads together from the source material, hasn't it? Trying to connect the dots on what makes Guyana's story so unique and complex. Hopefully you've got a clearer picture now.
Which really leaves us with a final, perhaps challenging thought for you, the listener, to ponder. It draws on everything we've discussed.
Given Guyana's long history of external influence, those deep internal divisions we talked about, and now this unprecedented opportunity and risk presented by oil.
How can the country possibly navigate this? How can it ensure this boom actually benefits all Guyanese, addresses those historical inequalities we traced, and protects its incredible environment?
Can it steer towards that good life for all mentioned in the sources? Or will it fall into that resource curse, that poverty trap the material warns about?
A huge question with no easy answers. Definitely something to keep thinking about.
Absolutely. Keep learning, keep questioning.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.